In the span of 37 seconds, a single decision changed everything. The roar of 80,000 voices suddenly turned to stunned silence. Security cameras captured it all. News outlets scrambled to understand what they had just witnessed. Social media exploded with theories, accusations, and disbelief. But before the world could process the magnitude of what had happened, 3 lives were already forever altered, and a nation's trust in its most sacred institutions began to crumble. What started as a routine day at one of America's most prestigious events became the moment that exposed a truth so shocking, so deeply buried in corruption and cover-ups, that even those who lived it struggled to believe it was real.
This is not a story about heroes and villains.
This is a story about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, where doing the right thing meant risking everything, and staying silent meant becoming part of something unforgivable. The guard who rushed forward that day wasn't supposed to be there. The crowd that screamed wasn't supposed to see what they saw, and the secret that was about to be revealed had been protected by powerful people for over 2 decades. But sometimes, the truth has a way of forcing itself into the light, no matter how many people try to keep it buried in darkness. Marcus Chen had been working security for 12 years, but he had never seen anything like the Washington Memorial Stadium on that crisp October morning. The presidential visit had transformed the usual controlled chaos of event preparation into something that felt more like a military operation. Secret Service agents moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their earpieces crackling with constant communication. Metal detectors had been installed at every entrance, and bomb-sniffing dogs had swept every inch of the building twice. The event was supposed to be simple. President Harrison would deliver a speech commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Freedom Memorial Foundation, a charity that provided support for families of fallen soldiers. It was the kind of feel-good event that politicians loved, complete with flag-waving families, military honors, and plenty of photo opportunities. The guest list included war veterans, Gold Star families, and several high-ranking military officials. Everything had been planned down to the minute. Marcus stood at his assigned position near the east entrance, watching as early arrivals began filtering through security. His job was straightforward: monitor the crowd, watch for anything unusual, and report any concerns to his supervisor, Janet Rodriguez. Marcus had requested this particular assignment because his younger brother Tony was scheduled to attend as part of a Veterans Honor Guard. Tony had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED explosion left him with a permanent limp and enough metal in his leg to set off airport security for the rest of his life. The morning sun streamed through the stadium's glass panels, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. Marcus checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. The event wouldn't begin until 11 o'clock, but already the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Volunteers in matching blue t-shirts guided guests to their seats, while media crews tested their equipment and adjusted their camera angles. That's when Marcus first noticed Dr. Elizabeth Carver. She moved through the crowd with a purposeful stride that immediately caught his attention. Unlike the other guests who chatted excitedly or posed for photos, Dr. Carver seemed focused on something else entirely. She carried a leather briefcase and kept checking her phone, her expression growing more tense with each message she read. Marcus had been trained to spot behavioral indicators of potential threats, and something about her demeanor triggered his instincts. Dr. Carver was 62 years old, though she carried herself with the energy of someone much younger. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple black dress with a small pin that Marcus couldn't quite make out from his position. According to the guest list, she was a retired Army psychiatrist who had worked with veterans suffering from PTSD. Her invitation came through the Memorial Foundation itself, which made her presence completely legitimate. But legitimate didn't always mean harmless. Marcus activated his radio. Control. This is Chen at East Entrance. I have a guest exhibiting possible stress indicators. Dr. Elizabeth Carver, row 15, seat 30-4. Requesting background verification. Janet's voice crackled back through his earpiece. Copy that, Chen. Running her now. Continue monitoring. As Marcus watched, Dr. Carver took her seat but immediately stood up again, scanning the crowd as if looking for someone specific. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened her briefcase and removed a manila envelope. She glanced around nervously before tucking the envelope inside her jacket. The stadium continued to fill. Marcus recognized several faces from news broadcasts. Senator Patricia Williams, who chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee, General Robert Hayes, who had served as the top commander in Afghanistan, and Maria Santos, the founder of the Freedom Memorial Foundation herself. Each arrival was carefully orchestrated with designated areas for media interviews and photo opportunities, but Marcus's attention remained fixed on Dr. Carver. She had now moved to the aisle, apparently heading toward the VIP section where the dignitaries were seated. This wasn't unusual in itself. Many guests tried to get closer to the action, but her body language suggested this wasn't casual mingling. She had the determined look of someone on a mission. Control, Carver is moving toward VIP section, still carrying unknown materials and jacket. Copy that. Background came back clean, Chen. Retired Army psychiatrist, served 25 years, honorable discharge. No red flags in security screening, but keep eyes on. Marcus began moving parallel to Dr. Carver's path, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid attracting attention. As he walked, he noticed other details that heightened his concern. Her shoes were practical, low-heeled, the kind someone would wear if they expected to need to move quickly. She kept touching the envelope inside her jacket as if making sure it was still there. Most telling of all, she hadn't spoken to a single other guest, despite being surrounded by people eager to share their stories and connect with fellow attendees. The VIP section was located directly in front of the main stage, separated from the general seating by red velvet ropes and staffed by additional security personnel. Dr. Carver approached the boundary and spoke briefly to one of the guards there. Marcus was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could see the guard shaking his head and pointing back toward the general seating area. Dr. Carver didn't return to her seat. Instead, she moved to the side of the VIP section and began walking along the perimeter, studying the layout and the security arrangements. This behavior was crossing the line from unusual to potentially problematic. Marcus quickened his pace. Control. Subject is now conducting apparent surveillance of VIP security measures. Recommend intervention. Negative, Chen. Secret Service's eyes on all VIP activity. Do not approach unless she attempts to breach security barrier. That's when Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Dr. Carver had stopped walking and was staring directly at General Hayes, who was seated in the front row of the VIP section. But it wasn't the normal look of recognition that guests might have when seeing a famous person. Her expression was one of pure, undiluted rage. The envelope she had been protecting so carefully was now in her hand. She was gripping it so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her other hand was reaching inside her purse. Marcus made a split-second decision that would later be called both heroic and reckless, depending on who was telling the story. He abandoned his post and began pushing through the crowd toward Dr. Carver, his hand moving to his radio to call for immediate backup. But before he could key the microphone, the lights in the stadium dimmed and the speakers crackled to life. The ceremony was about to begin. President Harrison's motorcade had arrived, and Secret Service protocols were now in full effect. Any sudden movement or disturbance would be met with overwhelming force. Dr. Carver had positioned herself less than 20 feet from General Hayes. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever had driven her to this moment, Marcus realized that the next few minutes were going to change everything. He could see the general clearly now, a distinguished man in his 70s, wearing a chest full of medals and ribbons. Hayes was laughing at something Senator Williams had said, completely unaware that someone was watching him with such intense focus. The president's security detail had taken their positions around the stage, their eyes scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. Marcus was close enough now to hear Dr. Carver muttering under her breath, though he couldn't make out the words. She had removed something from her purse, but her body blocked his view of what it was. The envelope was still clutched in her other hand, and she was taking deep breaths as if preparing herself for something. The crowd around them had grown quiet in anticipation of the president's entrance. Thousands of people were on their feet, many holding small American flags that had been distributed at the entrance. The media cameras were rolling, capturing every detail for broadcast to millions more watching at home. That's when Dr. Carver began walking directly toward General Hayes. Marcus broke into a run, no longer caring about protocol or the potential consequences of causing a disturbance. His training kicked in, and he began calculating angles and distances, trying to determine if he could reach her before she reached the general. The VIP security guards had noticed her approach, but they hadn't yet recognized it as a threat. "Security breach in VIP section," Marcus shouted into his radio, but his words were drowned out by the sudden roar of applause as President Harrison appeared on stage. Dr. Carver was now just 10 feet from General Hayes. The envelope was raised above her head, and Marcus could see that what she had removed from her purse was not a weapon, but a camera. She was preparing to take a photograph. But that didn't make sense. Why would someone risk causing a security incident just to take a picture? There had to be something more, something that Marcus was missing. The answer came when Dr. Carver finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the crowd. General Robert Hayes, this is for Captain Michael Carver, my son who died because of your lies. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Captain Michael Carver had been a minor news story several years ago, a young officer who had died in Afghanistan under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official report had classified his death as an accident, but there had been rumors, whispers of cover-ups and military investigations that went nowhere. General Hayes's face went pale as he recognized the woman approaching him. He stood up quickly, knocking over his chair, and began backing away. But Dr. Carver wasn't trying to harm him physically. She was trying to expose him. "Tell them what really happened to my son," she shouted, holding up the envelope. "Tell them about the orders you gave. Tell them about the mission you authorized without proper intelligence." The crowd around them had begun to realize that something was happening. People were pointing and murmuring, trying to understand why this woman was confronting the general. The Secret Service agents were moving now, converging on the disturbance with practiced efficiency. Marcus reached Dr. Carver just as the first Secret Service agent arrived, but instead of tackling her or trying to restrain her, he positioned himself between her and the approaching agents. "Ma'am, I'm security for this event," he said calmly. "I need you to lower the envelope and step back." "Doctor," Carver looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You don't understand. My son died because of this man's incompetence, and the army covered it up. I have proof. 23 years of lies, and I finally have proof." The Secret Service agent was speaking urgently into his wrist microphone, calling for additional backup and medical support. President Harrison had been quickly escorted off the stage, and the event was being placed on immediate lockdown. But the damage was done. The crowd had heard everything, and cameras had captured it all. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. His duty was to maintain order and assist law enforcement. But something about Dr. Carver's desperation, something about the pain in her voice, made him hesitate. "What kind of proof?" he asked quietly. She pressed the envelope toward him with shaking hands. "Documents, communications. Evidence that my son's death wasn't an accident. Evidence that General Hayes knew the mission was compromised but ordered it anyway because he wanted a photo opportunity for the press." The Secret Service agent stepped forward. "Sir, I need you to step aside. Now." Marcus looked back at the agent, then at Dr. Carver, then at General Hayes, who was being ushered away by his own security detail. The general's face was no longer pale. It was flushed with what looked like guilt and panic. In that moment, Marcus made the second decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of stepping aside, he took the envelope from Dr. Carver's hands. The crowd screamed as additional security rushed forward, but Marcus Chen, a security guard who had just been trying to do his job, was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a weapon or a bomb. Sometimes it's the truth. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as Marcus Chen clutched it against his chest. Around him, chaos erupted in slow motion. Secret Service agents were shouting commands, their hands reaching for weapons. Stadium security guards were pushing through confused crowds, trying to establish a perimeter. News cameras that had been focused on the empty presidential podium suddenly swung toward the commotion in the VIP section. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he never could have imagined. Dr. Elizabeth Carver stood beside him, no longer the tense, angry woman who had been stalking General Hayes just moments before. Instead, she looked oddly peaceful, as if a burden she had carried for 23 years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Sir, drop the envelope and step away from the woman," the lead Secret Service agent commanded. His name tag read Thompson, and his hand rested on the grip of his sidearm. "This is your final warning." Marcus raised his free hand in a gesture of compliance, but he didn't release the envelope. Something about the general's reaction had convinced him that Dr. Carver was telling the truth. Hayes had looked like a man who had just seen his worst nightmare come to life. "Agent Thompson," Marcus said, reading the name tag. "I'm Marcus Chen, Stadium Security. This woman claims to have evidence of a military cover-up involving the death of her son. Before we do anything else, shouldn't someone look at what she's brought?" Thompson's expression didn't change. "Sir, that's not your decision to make." Place the envelope on the ground and step back. "But, Doctor," Carver spoke up, her voice stronger now than it had been all morning. "My son was Captain Michael Carver, 24th Infantry Division. He died on October 15, 2002, in Afghanistan. The army told me it was a training accident. They said he was killed when an unexploded ordnance detonated during a routine patrol. She paused, looking directly at the news cameras that were now recording everything. Marcus realized that this had been her plan all along. She hadn't come here to hurt anyone. She had come here to expose the truth in the most public way possible.
That was a lie, she continued.
My son died because General Hayes ordered an unauthorized mission into hostile territory without proper intelligence or backup. He wanted footage for a documentary about American heroes. My son and 3 other soldiers died so that man could have a good story to tell. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the Secret Service agents seemed uncertain about how to proceed. This wasn't a typical security threat. This was something much more complicated. Marcus looked around and saw thousands of faces staring back at him. Many of them were veterans and military families who had come to honor their fallen loved ones. In their eyes, he saw a mixture of confusion, concern, and something else, a hunger for truth that had been building for years. He made his third life-changing decision in less than 5 minutes. "Agent Thompson," Marcus said clearly, "I'm going to open this envelope and read what's inside. If it's nothing, then you can arrest both of us and we'll all go home. But if it's what she says it is, then maybe the American people deserve to know." Before Thompson could respond, Marcus carefully opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of documents, military communications, intelligence reports, and what appeared to be personal correspondence. The top document was a memorandum dated October 12, 2002, 3 days before Captain Carver's death. Marcus began reading aloud. From Colonel Robert Hayes to Captain Michael Carver. "Michael, I need you to take your squad into the Kandahar Valley tomorrow. I know intelligence says it's not secure, but we have a documentary crew coming next week, and I need footage of American soldiers helping local civilians. This is a direct order. Make it look heroic." The silence in the stadium was deafening. Marcus continued reading. Captain Carver's response: "Colonel, respectfully, my scouts report heavy insurgent activity in that area, requesting additional reconnaissance before proceeding." Carver. The third document was Hayes's final response. "Captain, the documentary is being produced by the same people who did that piece about the 2nd Infantry last year. This could mean major recognition for our unit and significant career advancement for all involved. The mission is authorized." "That's final, Hayes." Marcus looked up to see General Hayes being restrained by his own security detail. The man was trying to push through the crowd toward the exit, but the stadium was now in complete lockdown. No one was leaving until this situation was resolved. "Dick." Carver stepped forward, addressing the crowd directly. "My son sent me a letter that arrived 2 days after his death. He wrote it the night before the mission. He told me he had been ordered to take his squad into an area that hadn't been cleared, and that he was afraid his colonel was more interested in glory than safety." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. "This is that letter." Michael wrote, "Mom, if something happens to me, I want you to know that we're being sent on a mission that everyone knows is dangerous, but Colonel Hayes says it's important for morale back home. I've tried to argue, but he won't listen. I just want you to know that whatever happens, I was trying to do the right thing." The crowd began to murmur, and Marcus could see people taking out their phones to record what was happening. This was no longer just a disrupted ceremony. This was becoming a national moment. Agent Thompson was receiving rapid instructions through his earpiece. After a moment, he stepped closer to Marcus. "The envelope and all its contents are now evidence in a federal investigation. You need to hand everything over immediately." Marcus looked down at the documents in his hands. Among them were photographs, copies of military records, and what appeared to be witness statements from soldiers who had served with Captain Carver. Dr. Carver had spent over 2 decades gathering this evidence. "Agent Thompson," Marcus said, "with all due respect, the cat's already out of the bag. Everyone here has heard what these documents say. Are you going to arrest a grieving mother for telling the truth about her son's death?" That's when Janet Rodriguez, Marcus's supervisor, appeared at his elbow. She had been watching the entire scene unfold from the security command center, and her expression was a mixture of pride and concern. "Chen," she said quietly, "you realize your career is probably over, right?" Marcus nodded. "I know. But sometimes doing the right thing is more important than keeping your job." Janet smiled grimly. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." She turned to Agent Thompson. "I've been watching this whole thing on the security cameras. Everything that's happened here has been peaceful. Doctor, Carver hasn't threatened anyone or attempted to cause harm. She's exercised her right to free speech in a public forum. Thompson's jaw tightened. This is a presidential security event. Normal rules don't apply. Actually, came a new voice from behind them. They do. Everyone turned to see a tall woman in a sharp business suit approaching. She had shoulder-length brown hair and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. Her badge identified her as Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, FBI. Agent Thompson, she continued. I've been monitoring this situation from federal headquarters. Based on what I've heard, this woman may have evidence of criminal misconduct by a high-ranking military officer. That makes this a federal case, and it takes precedence over your security protocols. Thompson looked uncertain. Ma'am, I need to contact my supervisor. You do that? Agent Mitchell said. In the meantime, Mrs. Carver, I'd like you to come with me so we can discuss what you have here in a more appropriate setting. Dr. Bid, Carver shook her head firmly. No, I've tried going through proper channels for 23 years. I've contacted senators, congressmen, military investigators, and journalists. Everyone told me the same thing. There's no evidence, the case is closed, move on with your life. She gestured toward the crowd.
These people deserve to know what happened.
The families of the other soldiers who died that day deserve to know. The American people deserve to know that their military leaders sometimes make decisions based on politics and publicity instead of the safety of their troops. Marcus found himself nodding in agreement. He looked out at the crowd and saw his brother Tony in the veterans section. Tony was standing with his fellow soldiers, and every one of them was listening intently to Dr. Bagg, Carver's words. Agent Mitchell seemed to consider the situation carefully. Finally, she spoke. Mrs. Carver, I understand your frustration with the system, but if you really want justice for your son, then you need to work within that system. What you've done here today has gotten people's attention. That's important. But now we need to follow proper procedures to make sure this evidence is properly examined and that anyone who broke the law is held accountable. Dr. Carver looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, then back at Agent Mitchell. What guarantee do I have that this won't just be buried again? You have my guarantee, Mitchell replied. And you have something else. Witnesses. Everything that's happened here today has been recorded by dozens of cameras and seen by thousands of people. There's no going back now. Marcus realized that Agent Mitchell was right. Even if the FBI and the military wanted to cover this up, it would be impossible now. The story was already spreading beyond the stadium walls. But General Hayes had other plans. From across the VIP section, Hayes suddenly broke free from his security detail and began pushing through the crowd toward the exit. His movement was so sudden and desperate that it immediately drew everyone's attention. Stop that man, Dr. Carver shouted. He's destroying evidence. Marcus could see Hayes pulling documents from his jacket and tearing them up as he ran. Whatever those papers were, Hayes considered them important enough to risk everything to keep them secret. Agent Mitchell was already in motion, speaking rapidly into her radio and directing other federal agents to intercept Hayes. But the general had a head start and seemed to know the stadium's layout well. Marcus made another split-second decision. He handed the envelope to Dr. Berg. Carver and took off after Hayes, his security training and knowledge of the building giving him an advantage. He could hear footsteps behind him and realized that Janet was following as well. Hayes was heading for a service corridor that led to the parking garage. If he reached his vehicle, he might be able to escape before additional law enforcement could set up a proper perimeter. Marcus caught up with him just as Hayes reached the exit door. General Hayes, stop. You're making this worse for yourself. Hayes turned around and Marcus was shocked to see that the distinguished military leader was crying. Pieces of torn paper were scattered around his feet, and his uniform was disheveled from his frantic run through the crowd. You don't understand, Hayes said, his voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Those boys weren't supposed to die. Marcus kept his distance but blocked the exit door. Then tell people what really happened. If it was a mistake, if you're sorry, then say so. But don't run away from it. Hayes looked back toward the stadium, where the sound of approaching sirens could be heard. My career, my reputation, everything I've worked for, it's all gone. General, Marcus said gently, your career and reputation were built on a lie. Maybe it's time to build something new on the truth. Janet arrived just as additional FBI agents surrounded the area. Hayes looked at the circle of law enforcement officers, then at the torn papers at his feet, then back at Marcus. That young captain, Hayes said quietly, Michael Carver. He was right to question my orders. I knew that valley wasn't secure. I knew it was dangerous, but I thought we could get in and out quickly, get the footage we needed, and no one would get hurt. He sat down heavily on a concrete barrier. looking every one of his 73 years. When the attack happened, when those boys died, I panicked. I couldn't admit that I had sent them into danger for a publicity stunt. So I buried it. I classified the mission, sealed the records, and told the families it was an accident. Agent Mitchell had arrived and was recording Hayes' confession on her phone. General Hayes, I need to inform you that you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. As Hayes was led away in handcuffs, Marcus realized that the crowd in the stadium was still waiting for answers. Dr. Carver had accomplished what she had set out to do, but the cost was going to be enormous. Not just for Hayes, but for the military, for the government, and for everyone who had believed in the official story for over 2 decades. The truth, Marcus thought as he walked back toward the stadium, was often more complicated and more painful than anyone wanted to admit. But that didn't make it any less necessary. The news broke within hours. By evening, every major television network was running the story as their lead item. Social media exploded with hashtags like #CarverTruth and #JusticeForMichael. The footage of Dr. Elizabeth Carver confronting General Hayes in front of thousands of witnesses had been viewed millions of times before sunset. Marcus Chen sat in his small apartment, watching himself on television and wondering how his life had changed so dramatically in the span of a single day. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd arrived home. Reporters, government officials, and complete strangers all wanted to talk to the security guard who had made the split-second decision to help expose one of the military's most carefully guarded secrets. But it was the call from his brother Tony that affected him most deeply. Marcus, Tony had said, his voice thick with emotion, "You did something today that took real courage. A lot of us veterans have suspected for years that some of our brothers died because of bad decisions made by people who cared more about their careers than our lives. What you did today, it matters." Now, 3 days after what the media was calling the stadium incident, Marcus was beginning to understand the full scope of what Dr. Carver's evidence had revealed. The documents she had gathered over 23 years painted a picture of systemic corruption within certain levels of the military hierarchy, where public relations and political advancement had sometimes taken precedence over soldier safety. Agent Sarah Mitchell had been true to her word. The FBI investigation was moving quickly and transparently, with regular updates provided to the press and the families involved. But the case was revealing much more than anyone had expected. Captain Michael Carver hadn't been the only soldier to die as a result of questionable orders from Colonel Robert Hayes, who had later become General Hayes. The investigation had uncovered evidence of at least 6 other incidents over Hayes' career, where he had authorized dangerous missions primarily for their publicity value. In total, 17 American soldiers had died following orders that were later found to have been issued without proper strategic justification. Here, proper today. Carver had spent the last 3 days in FBI custody, not as a suspect but as a protected witness. The evidence she had gathered was extensive and meticulously organized. She had copies of military communications, photographs, witness statements from surviving soldiers, and even recorded phone conversations with military officials who had tried to discourage her from pursuing the truth about her son's death. But perhaps most damaging of all were the documents that General Hayes had been trying to destroy when Marcus and Janet had caught him at the stadium exit. Those papers contained evidence that Hayes' superior officers had known about some of his questionable decisions and had helped cover them up to protect the reputation of the military. Marcus was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee the following week, along with Dr. Carver and several other witnesses. The hearings were expected to last for months and would likely result in significant changes to military oversight and accountability procedures. However, not everyone saw Marcus as a hero. The criticism had started almost immediately after the news broke. Military supporters argued that he had violated security protocols and endangered public safety by interfering with Secret Service operations. Some accused him of being unpatriotic and of undermining public confidence in the armed forces. Anonymous online commenters had posted his home address and threatened him with violence for destroying a great American general. Janet Rodriguez had also faced consequences for supporting Marcus's actions. She had been suspended from her position pending a full investigation by stadium security management. The investigation was expected to determine whether she had violated company policy by failing to prevent Marcus from taking unauthorized action during a federal security event. But there were also supporters. Veterans organizations across the country had issued statements praising Marcus for having the courage to help expose military corruption. Gold Star families whose loved ones had died in service to their country had written letters thanking him for ensuring that their sacrifices weren't being dishonored by lies and cover-ups. The most unexpected support had come from within the military itself. Active duty soldiers and retired veterans had begun coming forward with their own stories of questionable orders and covered-up incidents. The hashtag #MarcusChenHero was trending on social media, with thousands of service members sharing their own experiences with commanders who seemed more interested in publicity than in protecting their troops. Dr. Carver had been released from FBI custody that morning and had immediately held a press conference outside the federal building in Washington. Marcus had watched it on television, struck by how different she looked from the desperate, angry woman he had encountered at the stadium. She appeared calm and determined, no longer carrying the weight of a secret that had consumed her life for over 2 decades. "I want to be clear about something," she had said to the assembled reporters. "I don't blame the military as an institution for what happened to my son. The vast majority of our military leaders are honorable people who put the lives of their soldiers above their own careers. But that doesn't mean we should ignore or cover up the actions of those who betray that trust." She had gone on to praise Marcus for his actions at the stadium. "Mr. Chen had no obligation to help me. He didn't know me or my son. But when he saw evidence of injustice, he chose to act. That's the kind of courage that built this country." The press conference had also revealed new details about Dr. Carver's long struggle to uncover the truth. She had spent her life savings on lawyers and private investigators. She had filed Freedom of Information Act requests, contacted congressional representatives, and even traveled to Afghanistan to interview soldiers who had served with her son. Her persistence had nearly destroyed her career and her personal relationships. She had been divorced twice, and her remaining family members had begged her to stop pursuing what they saw as a futile obsession. Several times, she had considered giving up and accepting the official version of events. But she had never stopped believing that her son deserved justice and that the truth mattered more than her own comfort or reputation. The investigation was also uncovering the sophisticated methods that had been used to keep the truth hidden. Military records had been altered or destroyed. Witnesses had been transferred to different units or pressured to sign confidentiality agreements. Family members who asked too many questions had been told that pursuing the matter further would jeopardize national security. Agent Mitchell had described it as one of the most extensive cover-ups in modern military history, involving dozens of people at various levels of command. Some had actively participated in hiding the truth, while others had simply looked the other way or chosen not to ask difficult questions. The financial costs were also staggering. The government had spent millions of dollars over the years on legal fees, settlements, and administrative efforts to keep these incidents secret. Several law firms had been paid substantial amounts to discourage families from pursuing wrongful death claims. But it was the human cost that truly shocked the nation. Marcus had received a call that morning from Rebecca Torres, the widow of Sergeant Carlos Torres, one of the other soldiers who had died in the same incident as Captain Carver. She had seen Dr. Carver's press conference and wanted to thank Marcus personally. For 23 years, she had said through tears, "I believed that my husband died in a training accident. I've spent all this time feeling guilty that I wasn't proud of him for dying a hero's death. Now I know that he was a hero. He died because he followed orders, even when he knew those orders were dangerous." Similar calls were coming in from families across the country. Children who had grown up believing their fathers had died due to their own mistakes were learning that their parents had actually been victims of someone else's poor judgment. Spouses who had struggled with guilt and anger were finally getting answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. The psychological impact was immense, but so was the sense of relief. Dr. Carver had described it during her press conference as finally being able to breathe again after holding your breath for 23 years. However, the revelations were also creating new problems. Trust in military leadership was plummeting. Recruitment numbers were dropping as young people questioned whether their lives would be valued appropriately if they chose to serve. Congressional representatives were calling for massive reforms and threatening to cut military budgets until new oversight measures were implemented. General Hayes, meanwhile, was being held in federal custody pending trial. His lawyers had indicated that he would plead guilty to multiple charges in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The plea agreement would likely result in a significant prison sentence and the loss of his military pension and benefits. The documentary that had cost Captain Carver his life was never completed. The production company had cancelled the project once they learned about the circumstances surrounding the mission they had wanted to film. The footage that had been shot before the incident was turned over to investigators as evidence. Marcus had learned that the production company had paid the military a substantial fee for access and cooperation. Part of that money had reportedly been used to fund other public relations activities designed to improve the military's image with the American public. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A project designed to celebrate American heroes had resulted in the deaths of actual heroes, whose sacrifices were then covered up to protect the careers of the people responsible for killing them. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case was how easily it could have remained hidden forever. If Dr. Carver hadn't spent decades gathering evidence, if she hadn't chosen to confront Hayes at the memorial ceremony, if Marcus hadn't decided to help her instead of simply following security protocols, the truth might never have come out. Agent Mitchell had told reporters that there were likely other similar cases that would never be uncovered because the evidence had been successfully destroyed or the witnesses had been silenced. The investigation into Hayes was revealing the methods and systems that had been used to hide military misconduct, but it couldn't reveal every instance where those methods had been successfully employed. That evening, as Marcus prepared for another night of phone calls from reporters and congressional staff members, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had made him a central figure in one of the biggest military scandals in American history. He thought about Dr. Carver, who had sacrificed everything for the truth about her son's death. He thought about Captain Michael Carver and the other soldiers who had died following orders they knew were dangerous. He thought about the families who were finally getting answers and about the military leaders who had betrayed the trust of the people they were supposed to protect. But mostly, he thought about the choice he had made in that moment, when Dr. Carver had pressed the envelope into his hands. He could have followed protocol, handed her over to security, and gone back to his normal life. Instead, he had chosen to listen, to care, and to act. It was a choice that had changed everything, not just for him, but for thousands of people who had been living with lies for over 2 decades. And as difficult as the consequences had been, Marcus knew he would make the same choice again. 6 months after the stadium incident, Marcus Chen stood in a congressional hearing room, raising his right hand to take an oath before the House Committee on Armed Services. The room was packed with reporters, military families, and government officials. C-SPAN cameras were broadcasting the hearings live to millions of viewers across the country. The investigation had grown far beyond anyone's initial expectations. What had started as a case involving one corrupt general and the death of 4 soldiers had expanded into a comprehensive examination of military accountability that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Dr. Elizabeth Carver sat at the witness table beside Marcus, no longer the desperate woman who had confronted General Hayes at the stadium. She had become a symbol of persistence and maternal love, appearing on magazine covers and news programs as the mother who had never given up fighting for her son. But Marcus could see the toll that the last 6 months had taken on her. Despite the vindication she had finally received, she looked exhausted. The committee chairman, Congressman David Morrison from Ohio, called the session to order. Morrison was a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq before entering politics. His reputation for fairness and his military background gave him credibility with both veterans organizations and military leadership. Dr. Carver and Mr. Chen, Morrison began. This committee has spent 6 months investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Captain Michael Carver and other incidents involving former General Robert Hayes. We've reviewed thousands of documents, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and examined military protocols and procedures. Today, we want to hear directly from the 2 people whose actions brought this matter to light. The hearing room fell silent as Dr. Carver leaned toward her microphone. She had testified before the committee 3 times already, but this was expected to be her final appearance. Congressman Morrison, members of the committee, she began. I want to start by saying that this has never been about revenge or hatred. This has been about truth and accountability. My son Michael died because someone in authority made a decision that prioritized publicity over prudence. But more importantly, the circumstances of his death were covered up for over 20 years, denying his family and the families of other fallen soldiers the truth they deserved. She paused, looking directly at the cameras. The investigation has shown that General Hayes was not acting alone. The cover-up involved multiple levels of military command and continued for decades. Officers who knew the truth chose to protect their careers instead of honoring the soldiers who died following questionable orders. Marcus watched as several committee members took notes. The investigation had indeed revealed a complex web of complicity that went far beyond Hayes himself. 3 other general officers had been implicated in various aspects of the cover-up, and 2 had already been forced to retire in disgrace. Dr. Carver continued her testimony by describing the obstacles she had faced over the years. Military officials had repeatedly told her that investigating her son's death would compromise national security. Lawyers had warned her that pursuing legal action could result in criminal charges against her for interfering with military operations. At one point, she had been told that continuing her inquiry could jeopardize the careers and safety of other soldiers who had served with her son. The message was clear, she said. Be quiet, be grateful for your son's service, and don't ask questions that might embarrass important people. But the most damaging testimony came when Dr. Carver described the systematic destruction of evidence that had occurred over the years. Military records had been altered to remove references to the true nature of the mission that had killed her son. Communications between Hayes and his superiors had been reclassified and then lost during routine file purges. Soldiers who had witnessed the incident had been transferred to different units and discouraged from discussing what they had seen. It wasn't enough to lie about what happened, Dr. Carver said, her voice growing stronger. They had to actively work to make sure the truth could never be discovered. That's not a mistake or an error in judgment. That's a conspiracy. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he found himself facing questions that he had been thinking about for months. Why had he chosen to intervene? Did he understand the potential consequences of his actions? What did he think should be done to prevent similar incidents in the future? Congressman Morrison, Marcus said, I want to be clear about something. I'm not a hero. I'm just a security guard who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But I do think that sometimes ordinary people have to make extraordinary choices. He described the moments leading up to his decision to help Dr. Carver, explaining how her behavior had initially appeared threatening but had ultimately revealed itself to be desperate rather than dangerous. When I heard her story and saw the evidence she had gathered, I realized that this wasn't a security threat, this was a mother seeking justice for her son's death. And when I saw General Hayes's reaction, when I saw the panic in his eyes, I knew that she was telling the truth. Marcus went on to describe the broader implications of what they had uncovered. This isn't just about one corrupt general or one tragic incident. This is about whether we can trust our military leaders to be honest with us and with the families of the soldiers they command. The investigation had revealed that Hayes's pattern of authorizing dangerous missions for publicity purposes had been known to his superiors for years. Rather than stopping him or holding him accountable, they had chosen to manage the situation by covering up the results when missions went wrong. Internal military communications that had been uncovered during the investigation showed that senior officers had discussed Hayes's public relations enthusiasm and had developed protocols specifically for managing the fallout when his missions resulted in casualties. One particularly damaging email from a Pentagon official had referred to Hayes's victims as acceptable losses in service of the broader mission. The broader mission had been defined as maintaining public support for military operations through positive media coverage. Marcus testified about the personal cost of his decision to help Dr. Carver. He had lost his job at the stadium and had difficulty finding new employment due to the controversy surrounding his actions. Some potential employers saw him as a troublemaker who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. Others worried that hiring him would bring unwanted media attention to their businesses. But he had also received unexpected support from organizations across the country. Veterans groups had offered him jobs and speaking opportunities. Legal defense funds had been established to help cover his expenses during the congressional hearings. Most importantly, he had received thousands of letters from military families thanking him for helping to expose the truth about their loved ones' deaths. I've learned that doing the right thing isn't always easy or comfortable, Marcus told the committee. But I've also learned that the alternative, staying silent when you know something is wrong, is much harder to live with. The hearing room erupted in applause, causing Chairman Morrison to call for order. But Marcus could see that many of the spectators, particularly those wearing military service pins or Gold Star family buttons, were moved by his words. The committee then heard testimony from Colonel James Patterson, a military investigator who had been assigned to review Hayes's entire career for evidence of misconduct. Patterson's findings were devastating. Committee members, Patterson testified. Our investigation has identified 17 separate incidents over General Hayes's career where he authorized missions that resulted in unnecessary casualties. In each case, the missions were characterized by inadequate intelligence, insufficient backup, and objectives that appeared to be more focused on generating positive publicity than achieving strategic goals. Patterson went on to describe the sophisticated cover-up network that had protected Hayes throughout his career. When missions went wrong, a coordinated response would immediately begin to control the narrative and protect Hayes from consequences. Families would be told that their loved ones died heroes' deaths in classified operations, Patterson explained. Military records would be altered to support these stories. Witnesses would be transferred or pressured to sign confidentiality agreements. In some cases, evidence was simply destroyed. The most shocking revelation came when Patterson testified about the financial aspects of the cover-up. Over the years, the military had paid millions of dollars in settlements to families who had threatened legal action over their loved ones' deaths. The settlements included strict non-disclosure agreements that prevented families from discussing the circumstances of the deaths. In effect, Patterson said, we were using taxpayer money to buy the silence of grieving families. The committee also heard from several of Hayes's former subordinates who had finally agreed to testify about their experiences serving under him. Their stories painted a picture of a commander who was obsessed with his public image and willing to risk soldiers' lives to enhance his reputation. Major Jennifer Walsh, who had served as Hayes's aide-de-camp for 2 years, testified that Hayes had maintained detailed files on journalists and documentary producers who might be interested in covering military operations. He had actively sought out opportunities to participate in media projects, even when doing so required diverting resources from more important missions. General Hayes used to say that winning hearts and minds back home was just as important as winning battles overseas, Walsh testified. But somewhere along the way, he started to believe that his personal reputation was more important than the lives of the soldiers under his command. Walsh described incidents where Hayes had ordered missions specifically because they would provide good footage for television news reports or documentary films. Soldiers had been required to repeat dangerous operations multiple times to get better camera angles. Equipment and personnel had been diverted from legitimate military objectives to support Hayes's media activities. We all knew it was wrong, Walsh said, tears in her eyes, but General Hayes was a powerful man with important connections. Speaking up would have meant the end of our careers. The hearing also revealed the international implications of Hayes's actions. Some of his unauthorized missions had violated agreements with allied nations and had complicated diplomatic relationships. The cover-ups had prevented proper notification to international partners, whose soldiers had also been affected by Hayes's decisions. As the day-long hearing drew to a close, Chairman Morrison asked Dr. Carver and Marcus what they believed should happen next. Dr. Carver spoke first. I want accountability, not just for General Hayes, but for everyone who helped hide the truth. And I want systemic changes that will prevent this from happening again. No other mother should have to spend 23 years fighting her own government for the truth about her child's death. Marcus added, I think we need to remember that our military is made up of ordinary people who volunteered to serve their country. They deserve leaders who will value their lives above personal ambition. And they deserve a system that will tell the truth when things go wrong, even if that truth is uncomfortable. The hearing concluded with Chairman Morrison announcing that the committee would issue a comprehensive report within 30 days, along with specific recommendations for military reform. Several members indicated that they plan to introduce legislation requiring greater transparency in military operations and stronger protections for whistleblowers who report misconduct. As Marcus and Dr. Carver left the hearing room, they were surrounded by reporters and family members of soldiers who had died under Hayes's command. The investigation had identified dozens of additional cases where Hayes's decisions had resulted in casualties, and many of those families were finally learning the truth about their loved ones' deaths. Outside the Capitol building, Dr. Carver was approached by Maria Santos, whose son had died in a mission Hayes had authorized in Iraq in 2005. Santos had spent 15 years believing that her son had been killed by enemy fire during a routine patrol. The investigation had revealed that he had actually died during an unauthorized reconnaissance mission that Hayes had ordered to gather intelligence for a planned media interview. Dr. Carver, Santos said, I want to thank you for never giving up. Because of what you did, I finally know that my son died serving his country, not because of some random tragedy. The two mothers embraced, united by their shared loss and their newfound understanding of what had really happened to their children. As Marcus watched the interaction, he realized that the stadium incident had been just the beginning of a much larger story. The truth about General Hayes's actions was bringing closure to families across the country, but it was also forcing the entire nation to confront difficult questions about accountability, transparency, and the true cost of military service. The crowd that had screamed that day at the stadium had been witnessing the start of a transformation that would affect American military culture for generations to come. 2 years after the stadium incident, Marcus Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Virginia, delivering a lecture to cadets at the Reserve Officers Training Corps program. The young men and women in the audience represented the next generation of military leaders, and Marcus had been invited to speak about ethics, accountability, and moral courage. The changes that had resulted from Dr. Carver's revelations and the subsequent congressional investigation had been sweeping and permanent. The Hayes Accountability Act had been passed by Congress and signed into law, establishing new oversight mechanisms for military operations and stronger protections for whistleblowers. The law required regular independent reviews of mission authorizations and mandated immediate family notification when soldiers died under circumstances that differed from initial reports. General Hayes himself had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and dereliction of duty. 3 other general officers had been court-martialed and removed from service. The military's public relations division had been completely restructured, with new policies requiring that all media activities be approved by ethics committees. But the most significant change had been cultural. The military had implemented comprehensive ethics training at every level of command, with specific emphasis on the responsibility of leaders to prioritize soldier safety over personal or institutional reputation. The case studies used in this training featured real examples from the Hayes investigation, ensuring that future officers would understand the human cost of placing public relations above soldier welfare. Dr. Carver had become a national advocate for military transparency and family rights. She had established the Michael Carver Foundation, which provided legal assistance to military families seeking information about their loved ones' deaths. The foundation had already helped dozens of families uncover the truth about incidents that had been covered up or misrepresented by military officials. Before we begin, Marcus told the cadets, I want you to understand something. I'm not here to criticize the military or to discourage you from serving your country. I'm here because service members deserve leaders who will value their lives and tell the truth about their sacrifices. He began his presentation by describing the events at the stadium, but he focused on the moments of decision that had shaped everything that followed. His choice to help Dr. Prayer. Dr. Carver, instead of following security protocols, her choice to spend decades pursuing the truth instead of accepting the official story. Agent Mitchell's choice to conduct a transparent investigation instead of another cover-up. Every day in military service, you'll face choices, Marcus told the cadets. Most of them will be small decisions that seem insignificant in the moment, but some of them will define who you are as a leader and what kind of military we have as a nation. One cadet raised her hand. Mr. Chen, what would you say to someone who's afraid that speaking up about misconduct will ruin their career?
Marcus paused, considering the question carefully.
I'd say that your career isn't worth more than the lives of the soldiers you're responsible for protecting. But I'd also say that the military has changed since the Hayes case. There are now formal channels for reporting concerns, and there are legal protections for people who report misconduct in good faith. He gestured toward a man sitting in the front row. Colonel Martinez here can tell you more about those protections. Colonel Luis Martinez stood and addressed the cadets. He had been appointed as the military's first Inspector General for Ethics, a position created in response to the Hayes investigation. His office was responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and ensuring that whistleblowers were protected from retaliation. Mr. Chen is right, Martinez said. The system has changed dramatically. We've learned that protecting misconduct doesn't protect the military. It undermines the trust and confidence that are essential to military effectiveness. Martinez went on to describe several cases where soldiers had reported concerns about their commanders and had been protected from retaliation. In some instances, the reports had led to changes in policies or procedures that had prevented accidents or saved lives. The key is to remember that loyalty doesn't mean blind obedience, Martinez explained. True loyalty means having the courage to speak up when something is wrong, even if it's uncomfortable or difficult. After the formal presentation, Marcus was approached by Cadet Sarah Thompson, a junior studying military history. Thompson had written her thesis on the Hayes case and had interviewed several of the soldiers who had testified during the congressional hearings. Mr. Chen, she said, I've read everything I could find about what happened, but I still have one question. Do you ever regret getting involved? Marcus smiled. That's a question I get asked a lot, and the answer isn't simple. I regret that it took so long for the truth to come out. I regret that Dr. Steele Carver had to fight for 23 years to get justice for her son. I regret that other families suffered because the system failed them. He paused, looking out the window at the campus where future military officers were learning about leadership and responsibility. But do I regret helping Dr. Carver that day? No, never. Because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following the rules. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. My professor says that the Hayes case is taught in military academies around the world now as an example of what can go wrong when accountability breaks down. Do you think that's having an impact? I think it's making people think more carefully about their responsibilities, Marcus replied. But real change happens one decision at a time, made by individuals who choose to do what's right even when it's difficult. That evening, Marcus attended a dinner hosted by the university for distinguished speakers. He found himself seated next to Dr. Rebecca Foster, a military psychologist who had studied the long-term effects of the Hayes revelations on military culture. The data is quite remarkable, Dr. Foster told him. Surveys show that trust in military leadership has actually increased since the Hayes case was exposed. It seems counterintuitive, but transparency and accountability have strengthened the institution rather than weakening it. She explained that recruitment numbers had initially declined following the scandal, but had rebounded strongly as young people gained confidence that the military was serious about reform. Exit interviews with departing service members showed that concerns about corrupt leadership had decreased significantly. The military learned something important, Dr. Michael Foster continued. Hiding problems doesn't make them go away, it just makes them worse. By confronting the Hayes case directly and implementing real reforms, the military demonstrated that it's capable of learning from its mistakes. Dr. Capwidge. Foster also shared data about the families who had been affected by Hayes' actions. Many had reported feeling a sense of closure and healing after learning the truth about their loved ones' deaths. Support groups had been established to help families process the revelations, and the military had provided counseling services to anyone who needed assistance. Dr. Carver's courage to speak out didn't just expose one corrupt general, Dr. Foster said. It gave voice to dozens of families who had been silenced by fear and bureaucracy. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Carver herself, who had arrived at the dinner after completing her own speaking engagement at the university's law school. She had been invited to discuss the legal and ethical implications of government cover-ups with students studying public interest law. Marcus, she said warmly, embracing him like an old friend. How did your talk go? Did the cadets give you a hard time? They were great, Marcus replied. Very thoughtful questions. I think they really understand the importance of what happened. Dr. Pre sighed. Carver had aged visibly in the 2 years since the stadium incident, but she carried herself with a confidence and purpose that hadn't been there before. The constant stress of fighting for the truth about her son's death had been replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that her efforts had led to meaningful change. I've been thinking about something, she said to Marcus and Dr. Foster. My son Michael wrote in his last letter that he wanted me to know he was trying to do the right thing. For 23 years, I thought he was talking about following orders, even orders he disagreed with. But now I wonder if he was trying to tell me that he had spoken up about the dangerous mission, that he had tried to protect his soldiers. She pulled out a folder containing documents that had been recovered during the investigation. We found communications from Michael to his fellow officers warning them about the risks of the mission General Hayes had ordered. He had tried to get additional reconnaissance, tried to delay the operation until they had better intelligence. Dr. Foster leaned forward with interest. You mean Captain Carver was actually trying to prevent the incident that killed him? Exactly, Dr. Carver replied. He knew the mission was dangerous and he tried to make it safer. When that didn't work, he made sure his soldiers knew what they were facing. He died trying to protect the men under his command. Marcus felt a chill as he realized the full implications of what Dr. A. Carver was saying. So your son was already doing what we all learned to do because of his death. He was speaking up about dangerous leadership decisions.
Yes, Dr. Adia,
Carver said, tears forming in her eyes. And that makes everything we've done since then feel like continuing his work rather than just seeking revenge for his death. The dinner conversation continued late into the evening, with other guests joining the discussion about military ethics and accountability. Several retired military officers shared their own experiences with difficult leadership decisions and the lessons they had learned from the Hayes case. General Patricia Williams, who now served as the Director of Military Ethics at the Pentagon, described how the case had fundamentally changed the way the military approached public relations and media engagement. We used to think that good publicity was always good for the military, she explained. The Hayes case taught us that bad publicity resulting from misconduct is much more damaging than no publicity at all. Now we prioritize authentic achievement over manufactured image. Williams also discussed the international impact of the reforms. Other nations had studied the American response to the Hayes scandal and had implemented similar accountability measures in their own military organizations. The case had become a model for how institutions could recover from internal corruption through transparency and reform. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years ago, he had been a security guard making minimum wage and trying to put his life together after his own military service. Now he was being invited to speak at universities, military academies, and conferences around the world about ethics and leadership. But more importantly, the changes that had resulted from that day at the stadium were saving lives. The new oversight procedures had already prevented several missions that military investigators determined were too risky to justify. The ethics training had led to reports of misconduct that might otherwise have gone unaddressed. The transparency requirements had helped families get accurate information about their loved one's service. Carver walked with Marcus to the parking lot after the dinner. Do you know what I've learned these past 2 years? She asked. What's that? That the truth doesn't just set you free, she said. It sets everyone free. All those families who were carrying guilt and confusion about their loved ones' deaths, all those soldiers who were afraid to speak up about bad leadership, all those young people who were wondering whether they could trust the military with their lives. The truth gave all of them something they needed. Marcus nodded. And it gave the military something it needed too. A chance to be better. As they reached their cars, Dr. Carver turned back to him. You know, I still have that envelope, the one you took from me at the stadium. Would you like to have it? Marcus was surprised. Why would you want to give that to me? Because you're the one who made sure the world saw what was inside it, she replied. Without your decision to help me that day, it would just be a folder full of papers that no one would ever believe. Marcus thought about the offer for a moment. Actually, I think it should go to the Michael Carver Foundation. Let it be a reminder to other families that the truth is worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes.
Doctor!
Carver smiled. I think Michael would like that. As Marcus drove home that night, he thought about the crowd that had screamed when he rushed forward to help Dr. Cole Carver. They had been witnessing something unprecedented, the moment when a carefully constructed lie began to crumble under the weight of the truth. But they had also been witnessing something hopeful, the moment when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things, when institutional loyalty gave way to human decency, and when the courage of a grieving mother and a security guard changed the course of American military history. The crowd had screamed that day because they understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that they were watching something that would matter for generations to come. 2 years later, it was clear that they had been right.